right, welcome back to Fraud in America. I am Jackie DeMar, and today I have with me John Tycko of the law firm Tycko and Zavareei. John is an expert here in customs and tariff enforcement. He's going to help us out explaining kind of the basics of what we're looking at there and some basics about customs and tariff fraud. President Trump has already imposed some additional tariffs as he's come into office here. There's some opportunity there to enforce those tariffs through the use of the False Claims Act and other whistleblower laws. John, can you kind of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and your law firm?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. So I am a lawyer and I've been a litigator for about 30 years. I got into representing whistleblowers in key TAM cases. I think my first one was in 2008. So I guess I've been doing that for about 17 years. And our law firm, Tycko and Zavareei, we have a few different lawyers who handle key TAM cases all across the sort of normal spectrum of those cases. And I got involved in the customs and tariffs world, which is sort of a niche within a niche, if you will. Back in 2012 was the first time I did one of those cases, and I've probably done about 15 of them since.
Yeah, there's not a ton of people that kind of specialize in this area, but there are quite a bit of cases that deal with these issues. Can you kind of give us some high level kind of background on kind of what is a tariff, kind of just high level kind of what we're looking at there?
Right. Yeah. And sometimes the terminology can get a little
Yeah.
confusing and people use different words sort of interchangeably. So a tariff is, I think the way to think of it, it's just a tax on imports. It's a rule that says if you import a particular product, sometimes identified both by the product and by the country of origin, then the importer has to, basically pay a tax that is measured as a percentage of the value of the product to the government, and Customs and Border Protection, CBP, is the one that enforces those. The other words that get used are duties. Duties and tariffs, at least in the US system, are essentially the same thing, and the words get used interchangeably. When there's a tariff on products, what you pay to the government are the duties, but don't get too confused by that. The two words are essentially interchangeable.
And so when we're talking about putting tariffs on products coming in from other countries, we think of that as kind of a punishment to, or I guess, a punishment to that other country, but kind of the importer is actually paying those percentages, right?
Right. So every time something is imported into the country, there has to be what's known as an importer of record. That is the person or the company that has to go on record saying, we were the ones that imported this product. And there's, paperwork that they have to file with CBP to do that. And those are often, I would say more often than not, people or companies in the United States. And they're the ones that are on the hook for the duties that are owed to the government.
And so the impact of that is basically to prevent more imports from coming in because that's more costly to import those products. The down the road impact is then we will produce those products maybe in the United States instead.
Yeah, that's part of the theory. I mean, there are sort of different justifications for tariffs. I would say certainly like protection of domestic companies is a major sort of policy reason behind sort of, what we've seen, the increase in tariffs in recent years. The other side of it is that it does produce revenue for the government. So, it acts as a source of revenue as well. It sort of has both of those functions. Yeah.
What kind of revenue do you currently are we looking at as far as the tariffs we have in place now?
Yeah, as a percentage of all the money that the government collects, it's very small. I think in the last fiscal year, the federal government recovered about $77 billion in duties, but that's out of, I think, close to $5 trillion in total revenues, most of which is taxes. So it's about 1.6% of the government's total revenues. It's sort of a drop in the bucket.
And what are the kind of the major sources of tariffs now?
So there's a few different sources, different types of tariffs and duties, if you will, that we see in our whistleblower cases. So there are kind of just what are called normal duty rates that apply to products that come from many, many countries. These tend to be fairly low duty rates, anywhere from like 0 to single digit duty rates. And these have been in effect for many, many years. They're adjusted periodically for different products. And those are primarily a revenue generating tool for the government. But starting in about 2018, during the first Trump administration, for the first time in a long time, the United States imposed across the board tariffs that were much, much higher, particularly on goods coming in from China. So there was a round of tariffs that were put in place starting in 2018 that people generally refer to as the Section 301 tariffs, which is just a reference to a particular statutory provision that was used as the sort of authority for imposing those tariffs. And those are currently 25% tariffs that apply to a majority of products that are coming in from China, or at least I should be careful how I say it. It's not that the products are coming in from China, it's that the products are Chinese country of origin. And that's an important distinction. We could talk about that later if you want. But so that's the other source of the tariffs. And then we also have cases that involve what are called anti-dumping or countervailing duty orders. These are orders that are imposed under a different statute that's administered primarily by the Commerce Department. These are orders that are imposed when the government makes a finding that particular products from particular countries are being dumped, which means basically sold for below cost, or that they're being sort of unfairly subsidized by a foreign government. That's the countervailing duty part. And so when a finding like that is made, the Commerce Department will issue an anti-dumping countervailing duty order. We usually just call those ADCVD orders because we have to use initials and things. And those can range from tens of percent up to hundreds of percent. They're based upon some economic analysis of what rate of duty is necessary to kind of level the playing field for domestic industries. And those generally apply to particular products that are country of origin of particular countries. So it might be, widgets of a particular kind from Germany or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that's how those orders are defined. So right now, those are the three sort of main sources of tariffs or duties that we might encounter in a False Claims Act case. There's probably going to be a new one starting very soon because the current Trump administration is relying upon a slightly different source of authority for the new tariffs that are about to go into place against China and that might go into place against Canada and Mexico to be determined. But the source of authority there is a statute that is, I want to make sure I get this right. It is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA, which gives the president authority to impose tariffs to counter an economic emergency that has to be declared by the president. And so that's the theory under which the sort of new round of tariffs are being issued.
And then I also saw that President Trump announced perhaps some reciprocal tariffs in reaction to that taxes. Can you explain that one a little bit?
Yeah, I think what that is, it's not entirely clear as of the day that you and I are talking.
Yeah, this just happened last night.
Yeah, this is like the whole tariffs landscape is a fast breaking news item, and it has been for the last few weeks. But the idea of reciprocal tariffs, as I understand it, is that some branch of the executive branch, probably the U.S. Trade Representative or the Commerce Department, is supposed to do some review of all of the tariff rates that are imposed by other countries on U.S. goods, and then to try to match our tariff rates to those. So I think that's what they have in mind. I'm not exactly sure, which statute they're going to claim authority to do that under, but to some extent, that would just be an adjustment of the normal duty rates, which is something that's sort of commonly done. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. But I think overall, it's probably going to result in higher tariffs. I mean, right now, the United States has the highest average tariff rate of any country in the world, and they're only going up.
Yeah. So let's talk about what kinds of frauds we see involving these tariffs. So when an importer imports goods, the importer files document. It's called entry summary CBP form 7501, right? And
That's the
then
key
the
document. Yes.
and then the fraud is usually contained in that document, right? Can you kind of talk us through what that fraud usually looks like?
Right. Yes, you're absolutely right. So the entry summary, that is the document that the importer of record has to file with CBP every time goods come into the United States from a foreign country. And that document is what CBP uses to calculate how much is owed by the importer. And there are lots of sort of fields on this form. Sometimes it's a paper form, sometimes it's just submitted electronically. But the key ones that we generally are focused on in fraud cases, there's really kind of three key ones. The first one is just what are the goods that are being imported? So the form has to give a description of the goods and then also has to identify what's known as the Harmonized Tariff Schedule Code, the HTS code. And what the Harmonized Tariff Schedule is just essentially think of it as just this gigantic index that has thousands and thousands of numbers that correspond to all the different categories of products that we import into the country. And these codes are fairly standardized around the world. So they sort of follow products around. So on the entry summary, the importer has to identify the HTS code. And that's important because there's different duty rates, different normal duty rates that apply to different HTS codes. So that's the first one. The second key one is the country of origin of the product. And then the third one is the value of the products, because again, the amount that's owed is a percentage of the value. So the importer has to say what they think the value is, and they have to have some paperwork typically to back that up, an invoice showing how much they paid for the products. If it's an arm's length transaction, if it's a sort of a non-arm's length transaction that's just a intra-company or a related company transfer of goods, and there are some other ways that the value is calculated. But the idea is to try to get to sort of a market value of the product. So those are the three main things. It's what are you importing, what is the country of origin, and what is the value of the products. And those are the three sort of inputs into calculating how much the importer owes in duties.
And so then the fraud usually comes in misidentifying one of those things, right?
Exactly. And it can be any one of those three, or it can be some combination of those three, depending on what the sort of the fraud-feasing importer is trying to evade, right? So, I mean, the easiest one is just to lie about value. That is quite common, actually. In fact, in a majority of the cases we see, there is some amount of that. They're just telling CBP that the products are worth less than they really are. There'll often be sort of dual invoicing schemes where there's kind of the real invoice that they paid, but then they get a second fake invoice that shows a lower price. So that's kind of the easiest way to cheat, and we see that all the time. But we also see misclassification fraud where they're lying about which product they're importing, because you have to remember most of these products come in just in giant containers, like we've all seen them on boats or on the backs of trains or trucks, right? That's how the products come in. So they're listing, oh, here's what's in that container, right? And you can list things where the duty rates are lower, you'll pay less than if you list things where the duty rates are higher. So misclassification fraud, or just lying about what you're importing, is quite common. And then country of origin fraud as well, if there are particular tariffs that apply to particular countries. So, for example, the Section 301 tariffs that apply to China, country of origin goods, if you want to evade those tariffs, then you have to be able to say that your products were made in some country other than China. And sometimes we see that the fraud occurs in the claimed country of origin. So it's some combination of those three things are usually what's at stake.
And there are some countries we can't import goods at all, right? And so do you see cases where where I guess you just said where you'd have to pay much higher duties to import, I guess, goods from there. So you would see that they would misclassify where they were importing those goods from in order to get those goods into the country.
Right. If there's a particularly high rate, either like the Section 301 tariffs, which are 25%, or it could be an anti-dumping order, which again can be even higher than that, hundreds of percent.
Yeah.
Then there's an economic incentive to lie about the country of origin to get around those.
And then let's go back and talk about this substantial transformation piece of it, because so if I understand correctly, there's a difference between, the product of the country of origin, as far as if the parts are manufactured in one place, but then assembled in a different place, the country of origin might be different. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Right. So this is one of the most confusing parts of customs law. And so, all right, so you have these high tariffs that will apply to a particular product that is, what they basically say is the product of a particular country. So let's say you have, I'll just make something up. Let's say you'll have windshield wiper blades from China, okay? And let's say there's a high tariff rate that applies to that. So then the question is, okay, let's say you have some windshield wiper blades and they're coming from Vietnam, let's say by way of example, in the sense that is where the windshield wiper blades were loaded into a container and put on a boat at some port in Vietnam. And then they arrive in the United States. And the importer of record at that point has to declare, well, what is the country of origin of these windshield wiper blades? Now, imagine a situation where the metal frame of the windshield wiper blade was made in China, but the little rubber strip that goes along the edge of the windshield wiper blade was made in Vietnam. And then the two of them were assembled together into a completed windshield wiper blade in Vietnam. Well, is that a product of Vietnam or is that a product of China? And that's where the substantial transformation question comes in. The basic idea is, were the component parts substantially transformed into something new when they were assembled or not? And the answer to that question is sometimes obvious, but it's often not, because just the way that modern supply chains work. I mean, I gave a simple example of a windshield wiper blade that might have 2 or 3 parts, but imagine a piece of electronics or a larger machine, or even relatively simple things that like you might buy a blender and the plastic part of the blender might have been made in one company. The little metal blade might have been made in a second company. The motor that drives the little metal blade might have been made in a third company. And maybe all of those components were sent to a fourth country where somebody screwed them all together and put them in a box. So this substantial transformation question can get very complicated. Customs CBP has a process for answering these questions. If an importer wants to know what country of origin they should put down, they can ask for a ruling from CBP about that. And then those rulings are made public and anybody can read them. So there is sort of like a body of case law, if you will. They're not cases, but they're these letter rulings from CBP that over time have kind of established different rules for different product categories as to how we're going to determine what the country of origin of that product is. But as you might imagine, this is one way that a company could evade tariffs if they wanted to, right? By basically making all of the component parts, again, let's say in China, where those parts or the completed product might be subject to a tariff, moving them to a second country somewhere else in the world, screwing them all together in that second country, and then claiming that that second country is the country of origin. And we've seen this in many of our cases where that is really the basis of the fraud, because they're claiming the country of assembly as the country of origin, when in fact, the product for all intents and purposes is made in the first country. And this is very hard to detect without whistleblowers, because the government otherwise doesn't really have a lot of visibility into these supply chains right now. So they don't really have an independent way to challenge the country of origin claims of the importers. So this is probably the most tricky and most challenging part of some of the cases we've dealt with, are these substantial transformation issues.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that those are the kinds of cases, it sounds like, where whistleblowers would be most critical. I think there's some, it seems like even competitors might be able to be whistleblowers in this space if you can see that maybe your competitors selling something at a much lower price than they should be able to based on XYZ data that you can kind of see. But especially in cases like that, where there would be no way to know unless you were an insider and could give that information to the government, you really wouldn't know unless you had an insider whistleblower. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of the role of whistleblowers in this space?
Sure. Yeah. I think it's crucial and something that I think is going to be growing a lot over the next several years. So the way the system works now, the government on its own doesn't have a lot of visibility into how products are made, what the real country of origin is, what the value of the products are. They rely very heavily on just the importers being truthful when they fill out that CBP Form 7501. There's very little auditing of those, and there's very little inspection of containers coming across the border. So, the United States imports trillions and trillions of dollars of products every year. It's a huge flow that is coming across the border every single day. Ships in all of the major harbors, across the borders from Mexico and Canada, by plane, by train. There's multiple entry points, and just huge volumes of products are coming in mostly containerized every day. And the government doesn't have the resources to actually look inside those containers. So they really don't know what is coming into the country for sure. They are relying on the truthfulness of those entry summaries. I've heard statistics, something like 1%, maybe 2% of all containers get inspected. And when they're doing those inspections, what are they really looking for? They're mostly looking for drugs, guns.
Right.
They might sometimes do inspections to see if the products sort of match what's on the entry summaries. But even there, how would they really know? Like if, for example, the importer is lying about the value of the products, there's nothing that a customs agent looking inside of a container can see that would tell that customs agent that that value is a lie, or that the country of origin is a lie. So the inspections are infrequent and not that helpful. And so what that means is that this is a system that is very easy to cheat. And the repeat players in this business are well aware of that fact. And, one of the unfortunate sort of side effects of tariffs, I think, is that as the tariff rates go up, the incentives to cheat go up. And so what ends up happening is the unethical companies, the ones that are willing to cheat, suddenly actually have a competitive advantage over ethical companies that will just do the right thing and pay what's owed. And how do you combat that? The government can't really do very much on its own. It's not that they never catch cheaters on their own. They do sometimes. But like I said, so much of this stuff is invisible to the government that whistleblowers have played already a key part in exposing millions and millions of dollars in customs fraud that the government otherwise would never have known about. And there's a lot more that hasn't been exposed. So I think whistleblowers play a key role. You had asked about kind of like what are the types of whistleblowers we see in this case, and it is true that we often have clients who are either competitors who see one of their competitors cheating or suspect that one of their competitors are cheating, and we have to go investigate and see if we can build a case around that, or just other sort of industry insiders who sort of know who the players are in a particular industry, and something that one of them is doing doesn't make any sense. The prices are too low, or something is weird, and they look into it and discover that they're engaged in some kind of tariff evasion. We also have just more traditional whistleblowers like we get in other types of key tam cases, just employees, former employees who sees their employer doing something wrong. So it's a wide variety of different types of whistleblowers who have visibility into customs fraud and can come forward and help the government enforce those tariffs.
And this is a little bit in the weeds, but there is a case pending right now in the Ninth Circuit that basically potentially might throw a monkey wrench in all of these False Claims Act cases that are involving tariffs. Can you talk a little bit about that case very briefly, just so we are aware of it for anybody that's watching and maybe thinking about these kinds of cases under the False Claims Act?
Right. I think you're talking about the Island Industries case, right? Okay, right. And I know that we worked together on a amicus brief that Taft filed in this case. What can we say about the Island Industries case? It's a very strange situation. So there was a so the question here is, what is the court that you have to file a key TAM case in if you are alleging customs fraud? And there was a decision many, many years ago in the Ninth Circuit, which is, one of the appellate circuits that covers the West Coast. So it covers California, Oregon, Washington, where a lot of the biggest ports are. So this is important to customs law. That had suggested that if you are alleging customs fraud, that case has to be brought in the Court of International Trade, which is a specific court that only exists in New York City. So, and then later, the Court of International Trade itself said, we don't have jurisdiction over key TAM cases because of the way the False Claims Act is worded. Doesn't give us jurisdiction to consider those cases. So there was this sort of like weird situation that existed in the Ninth Circuit where you had one court, the court there saying, well, we can't handle these cases, go to the other court. And the other court saying, well, we can't handle these cases either, which meant that you couldn't bring them anywhere. So this issue had been sort of like out there. Nobody really took it that seriously. And there were plenty of customs enforcement cases going forward in the Ninth Circuit, and people were just sort of ignoring this little weird decision that was out there. And then it got brought up in this case in Island Industries, which was a key TAM case. It was a case between competitors. So this was a U.S. company that was suing a competitor alleging customs fraud. And the Ninth Circuit judges that were considering that case asked for briefing on this jurisdictional question. And I think that briefing was completed a couple of years ago at this point.
Yes.
And we're still awaiting a decision. I think there are some procedural wrinkles that explain why it's taken this long. But, so that I guess what I will say is that the existence of that case has not discouraged me from filing cases in the Ninth Circuit, because I can't actually believe that at the end of the day, the rule is going to be that you have to file these cases in the Court of International Trade. Although, if that turns out to be the rule, then we'll file them in the Court of International Trade.
Right.
So,
I agree.
Yeah. It's like one of these, it's almost like a first year law school civil procedure question, like something that lawyers love to think about. But I'm pretty confident that at the end of the day, the courts are just going to get it right, which is that these are False Claims Act cases. There's no question that the False Claims Act covers customs fraud. There's no question about that. So if you're engaged in customs fraud, you are violating the False Claims Act. That's not in dispute. The only question is, where do you have to file those cases if you're a whistleblower? And like I said, it's a interesting kind of procedural question, but I don't think it's going to really ultimately be a big sea change in how we do things.
Well, thanks so much, John. Obviously, these cases are a big priority for this new administration, and it's an evolving area we'll be keeping our eye on. Thanks so much for joining us, John. We really appreciate it. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in to Fraud in America. Thanks to Getnik Law for sponsoring our program, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
Our annual sponsor is Getnik Law, a boutique Manhattan law firm dedicated to fighting fraud and promoting business integrity. Learn more about the firm at www.getniklaw.com. If you believe you've witnessed fraud against the government or on the financial markets, or want to learn more about the laws that exist to fight fraud, visit taf.org, where you can find a directory of whistleblower attorneys who work across the country. On our website, you can find information about the nation's whistleblower laws and programs, and a way to donate to our organization as we continue to fight attacks on whistleblowers and these laws. Fraud in America is presented by the Anti-Fraud Coalition. Jacqueline DeMar is our host. James King is our executive producer. The website for Fraud in America was designed by Wide Eye Creative. Our artwork is by PPA Agency, and our theme song is by Spatial Relations.